And you're live.
Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome, everyone, to our February 25th meeting of our Chiefs Advisory Committee. I know, as we have in each of our meetings previous, have a very full and robust agenda to get through today. Thank you again for joining in this virtual format. And hopefully, in the near future, there is on the horizon a point where we'll all be able to come together in the same room. But until that time, certainly appreciative of us being able to come together in this format. So, without any further ado, I will turn it over to our co-chairs, Judge Dwayne Maynard and Ms. Ajmeri Hawk. Thank you.
Chief. Good evening to you all, and welcome to this meeting of the Chiefs Advisory Committee. As the Chief has mentioned, we have a full agenda tonight, and I would like to thank everyone on the call in advance for their time, concern, attention, and commitment to the work that we are endeavoring to accomplish on behalf of the department and the city of Dublin. Special thanks to Ajmeri for her work and input on tonight's agenda, to the Chief for continually being accessible to discuss the issues that come up seemingly on an every other day basis lately with Ajmeri and me, and to Rebecca and Becky for all of their behind-the-scenes efforts in coordinating this meeting/production. With that backdrop, Chief, let's move into attendance for tonight's meeting. If you would help me with the roll call, please.
Yes, sir. I'll walk through the roll call now. Judge Dwayne Maynard.
Here.
Ms. Ajmeri Hawk.
Here.
Dr. Shri Gadam.
Here.
Mr. Cameron Justice.
Here.
Ms. Susan Ortega.
Here.
Mr. Imran Malik. Ms. Courtney Ingram.
Here.
Mr. Isao Shoji.
Here.
And Ms. Stella Villalba.
Here.
Judge, on our end, we have attending tonight myself, both Lieutenants, Commander Somerville, Officer Amber McCloskey has checked in. It looks like Corporal Devin Howard's joining us from home as well. And we may have some other, another officer, Corporal Jake Stoll, joining us later. And then we have one additional guest who we'll introduce here in the next few minutes, but that is the roll call.
Super. Thank you very much. Want to say to both Courtney and Stella, it's great to have you on the line with us tonight. And to you, Stella, I want to share our prayers and condolences, and thank you for sharing what you did with us earlier today on the email thread.
Thank you. I appreciate those words.
It's time now to move into review of the minutes from last month's meeting. And if you want to take a look at those, you can see that they're lengthy. And I can assure you that Becky and I spent a fair amount of time trying to make sure that they are in good shape and order for anyone who might want to review the minutes from last month's meeting. Would you like some additional time to review the minutes, just generally? Anyone? If not, I would move for adoption of the January 2021 Chiefs Advisory Committee meeting as amended.
I second.
Oh, somebody's got to make the motion. I would entertain the motion first.
I move to adopt the minutes from January 2021.
As a minute.
I second.
Thank you. So it's been moved by Ajmiri and properly seconded by Esau for adoption of the January 2021 amended minutes of the Chiefs Advisory Committee as amended. All in favor signify with an aye.
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 Thank you. And is there anyone who is opposed? Okay, no opposition. The January 2021 minutes as amended are adopted. Next on the agenda would be old business. Is there any old business that needs to be addressed? Rebecca, anything that you have that would qualify as old business?
Not at the moment, Judge. I think that you had mentioned talking about some meeting availability.
Yeah.
But I don't have anything personally. Thank you.
Okay, great. Rebecca's right. One of the issues that was raised at our last meeting was what type of protocol might we follow if there were events that occurred like January 6th, 2021, between the time of, after a scheduled meeting and before we had another scheduled meeting. And there was a desire not to let as many weeks pass as did with the January 6th incident before we as a committee potentially got together to discuss whatever the issue of concern was. And I spoke to the chief about this, and between the chief and Rebecca, I'm hoping that there is at least something that could be offered for we as the committee to consider.
Yes, Judge, we did inquire through the clerk's office to determine what the stipulations might be. We would have to meet in order to call a impromptu meeting in between our scheduled meetings. And actually, if I can ask Director Somerville to weigh in on some of the information he found this afternoon as well. I don't know that we have the complete answer tonight, but I think that what Director Somerville may be able to offer points us in the right direction at the very least on the plausibility of how we would come together impromptu.
Great.
Thanks, Chief. Members of the committee, good evening. We did some research in Ohio Public Records Law about the requirement for public notice of public meetings by public bodies. And in the revised code, it requires every public body to adopt a regular process to provide adequate announcements for any public meeting, offering the ability for any member of the public to join and contribute to that public meeting. So I guess in short, that means we need to come up with a plan. There is not one necessarily described within the code. The code also goes on to describe two other types of meetings: a special meeting, which is a meeting to discuss any topics outside what would be a normal cadence for holding your regular meetings. That simply requires a general notice policy. It does add the additional burden that if this body has been notified by a member of the news media that they want to be specifically notified about your meetings, it does require us to give that media outlet a required notice. I'm not aware of any that have served us with that notice, but it does still require in the code that you give reasonable public notice for them to attend. There is a third option that relates to the calling of an emergency meeting. We had a discussion, we're waiting on some input back from that, but I think that gives us a little bit of guidance as opposed to us just having to make our own rules. There is, unless it can be demonstrated to be impractical, a requirement for 24 hours of notice. But it describes an emergency meeting as one where an immediate decision must be made for the betterment of the public body. And because this group does not essentially pass legislation, create emergency conditions or declarations, it's our opinion, and we're going to confirm this with legal in our clerk's office, that an emergency meeting wouldn't apply to this body. So any meeting that you would call would be a specialized meeting. We've asked legal to analyze, just do a quick review of how we post other special meetings within the city of Dublin, both in time frame and what is currently a generally accepted process to announce those meetings. Those of us that have been around a while remember when it used to be a newspaper of general circulation. I'm not sure we have newspapers of general circulation as much anymore. And getting something into the newspaper is not as easy as it used to be. But in this electronic age, we just want to confirm, and I'll bring back at your next meeting an absolute answer. If we need to have it before then, we'll have it. If something requiring or you desire to call a special meeting, we'll have an answer for you. But I'll report back legal's opinion about what are the minimum notification timelines and venues we have to hit in order to call those meetings.
All right. Well, that's plenty for us to chew on. Thank you for that, Jay. Being an attorney, I'm not going to ask you what revised code sections you looked at to come up with all of that, but I'll trust that when the time is appropriate for us to know, you'll share that information as well. I did want to give both Imran and Dr. Siri the opportunity to, maybe ask a question or two, or at least let us know if the information that the department has come back with is okay with you all, and the fact that they intend to follow up with us with additional information at our next meeting. Either of you, I can't see you guys, so you just have to.
Jed, can you hear me? Oh, this is Imran.
I can hear you now.
Okay, wonderful. I think the information is plenty and very informative as well, in a sense that the point that the third option that was discussed, or at least mentioned here, that we are not passing any policies or legislation, so that's why it might not be necessary for us to meet as an emergency body, like in any situation. But I guess maybe we can take it offline and discuss the first option, where if we do have to impromptu, have some information that needs to be circulated, maybe you and Ajmeri as the head of the committee can work with the chief and disperse some information within our email group that if need be, we can pass it on to the community members. So I guess some alternate option can be adapted here, but again, we can discuss that offline in a smaller, team format. So.
Yes. I think that a couple of things behind that, though. The email, it probably would be an email communication and an email notice, if you would, that we probably would have to not only work with the chief on, but also with Rebecca on getting that out to be in compliance. And then a lot of the discussion that we might need to have amongst ourselves, I think we've set up an appropriate community partner email thread that would allow us to do that and try to be responsive to whatever the issue is. So yes. Doctor, anything that you want to add or questions that you might have?
I think we cannot make emergency decisions or anything, so I would agree with Imran. And you, of course, email discussions will be better rather than, because of the time commitment, at the same time meeting everyone. It could be hard to communicate, just kind of bring all of us together in emergency time. But email, once we agree or disagree, then if still after the emails we still feel like we need to meet, then I would recommend that's when we should meet. Otherwise, I think email should be good.
Okay, great. Thank you. Anyone else have any thoughts or input that you would like to offer? All right, let's move on. We're doing good time-wise so far. To the Chief's update to the committee. And in conjunction with this section, I would say that Esau, you should be prepared to also offer your report on behalf of the task force. So, Chief, I'm turning it back over to you.
Thank you, Judge. And I made a promise to Rebecca Myers today I would be as succinct as possible because of our agenda. So the first piece I wanted to make sure we set context for, as we had discussion about the school resource officer program over the last several meetings. One of the recommendations that was made and that we wanted to make sure we addressed was making sure you had an awareness of the resources we have in connectivity to the school system. So without too much further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce our guest tonight and thank him for coming to us at relatively short notice, as we let him know earlier in the week. But it's my pleasure to introduce dear friend of mine and retired Dublin police officer Chuck Collier, who is now serves as the coordinator of safety and security at Dublin City Schools. So thank you very much and welcome, Chuck. Chuck, are you able to unmute? Sorry.
I say my best work when people don't listen to me, so I apologize for that. Thanks, Chief. I appreciate it. Thanks for having me on. I know some of you, obviously, but for those that don't know me, my name is Chuck Collier. I am currently working for the Dublin City Schools. I retired from Dublin Police back in November of 19, and then immediately started here with the schools. My role here, one of the facets of my role is I liaison with our school resource officers and make sure that partnership that we have between the school system and the police department is exactly what we need it to be. And that's based on community input, that's based on administrative input, that's based on teacher input. Anybody has the opportunity to come to me to speak about what good that SRO is doing or what they think that SRO is doing that they shouldn't be doing, as well as they have that ability to go to their direct administration, their building principals, things like that. So yeah, just real brief. We, as the district, obviously we have a really good partnership with the Dublin Police. I spent my last 5 years as the SRO at Jerome High School before I retired. So SROs do have a special place in my heart because once you get the right person in there, that person can do a whole lot of good. And I do think that we have some really good people in those roles. As we get older as an agency, as a department, we're going to have some transitions with people retiring eventually. So it's important that we as a community, we as a school district, and you guys as a police department, select and groom those right people with the right attitudes, with the right perspectives on how that role should be. We're fortunate in Dublin that we have school resource officers. We don't have school police. A school police and a school resource officer have two different missions. A police officer in the school, their mission is mostly to enforce the laws. We're thankful that we don't have those problems in our schools, that we don't have to do that. So we really embrace the triad concept of law enforcement first and foremost. You know, we want to make sure our buildings are safe and that our kids are safe while they're in the buildings. And then we have the education piece where our SROs are getting into classrooms, instructing on various topics, whether it's drug, bullying, legal issues, things like that. And then we also have a rather large role as informal counselor. Because we're in that building, because the SRO is seen almost daily by most people who walk through that door, there are a lot of kids who reach out to the school resource officer as that trusted adult. That's a piece that probably doesn't get as much play as it should, but I know when I was the SRO, most of my time was spent as that informal counselor, talking through, most of the time it wasn't even legal issues. It was, hey, my mom and dad are yelling at me and, things like this, or I didn't get my homework done, or, just run of the mill stuff that they enjoyed and needed an adult that they could reach out to and have that conversation with. That's where I think our Dublin Police School Resource Officer Program excels, is having that openness to treat kids like young adults, to let those kids have those conversations that maybe before they even knew who the school resource officer was, they didn't know who they could reach out to. It's a lot different reaching out to a school resource officer than it is a teacher. Coaches have a lot of that same ability. Just the closer you get to somebody as a person, the more open they are to come to you about whether it's a school issue, whether it's a home issue or something like that. We don't do a great job as people letting things off of our chest. So the more people that kids, especially kids that are going through these trying times with hybrid and remote and in school, out of school, all that stuff, the more options that we have to give those kids to reach out to somebody to get rid of some of that internal angst is better for all of us. So yeah, that's pretty much all I came here to say. If you have any questions about the program or how we work with the program within our schools, I can try to answer those. I probably won't have all of the answers to your questions, but I'm smart enough to know when to say, I don't know.
That's actually great. Definitely appreciate you coming out tonight and being a part of the meeting. We actually have some discussion that we would like to have with you being present. And we can make it the first item of new business so that you don't have to be here for the entirety of our meetings, because our meetings tend to be lengthy.
I would appreciate that.
Yes. But I would like to allow the chief to finish his update to us before we actually get into a more in-depth discussion with you, Officer Collier.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yep.
All right, Chief, you can keep going.
Chuck, thank you very much. Thank you, Judge. I will press through in an update, but I want to again lay some context for the bullet on the agenda tonight. So as both the Community Task Force and the Chiefs Advisory Committee were enacted through Council's Ordinance 4120 in August, there were specific requirements on reporting that were enacted as part of that resolution as well. For the Community Task Force, the goal was to have a comprehensive report to be returned to Council with recommendations by the end of their first year, which is scheduled for August of this year. So as they've been meeting, trying to gather some traction on how they're going to formulate their recommendations, they have worked on, and Mr. Shoji can certainly fill in the gaps that I jump over here, but they have formulated some subcommittees. They've had some discussion on particular topics, much the same as we've had as a group in the advisory committee meetings as well. In the most recent meeting, the city manager did some research to find a template plan that he thought might help them as a guide, or at least to consider to channel some of the discussion towards developing recommendations for council in that comprehensive report in August. The plan that we forwarded to you preceding this meeting was the plan that the city manager found from Beaverton, Oregon, and it's the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Plan, and it's the 2019 update. Using that as sort of a guide or template, the city manager presented last Tuesday to the Community Task Force the option to consider that plan as a framework for developing recommendations for their report to council in August. During that meeting, the community task force ultimately determined they would adopt some form of that framework to be able to move forward. In the plan was a recommendation that there would be a consideration for bullet points of the comprehensive plan that related to public safety. Instead of creating a separate public safety subcommittee of the task force had some discussion and considered that maybe the advisory committee could serve that purpose for developing bullets for the comprehensive plan and the overall plan coming from the community task force to be presented in August. The city manager and I discussed that. I certainly was supportive of that idea or concept, but we wanted to bring that request or recommendation back to this group so that you had some awareness of what that end target date would look like for the task force and what the sort of expectations would be. It would be very narrow to, or very focused on, I'm sorry, not narrow, but focused on public safety and developing recommendations from this group for the task force for that overall report. And so I may have missed some pieces in the middle there, but I will ask Esau if he can just share his perspective as well from Tuesday's meeting, as both he and I attended last week.
Thank you, Chief. I believe Chief did an excellent job with the summary of it. I don't know that there was any point that was missed. I would say though, a couple of points that I perhaps can emphasize a little bit over and beyond what he said. So this is, this to me, sitting on both meetings, ours and the task forces, seemed like a natural ask for the task force to make. I don't know if everybody had a chance to review the Beaverton document, but the public safety area certainly seems natural for us to take up. And they recognize that. They have not touched anything that has to do with public safety, knowing that this committee exists. So they felt that this would be the natural division of labor. The only thing that I felt a little bit uneasy about that evening, not because of what they were asking if we would be willing to do here, but because of timeline, because of different mandates that are placed on the task force versus the Chiefs Advisory Committee. The task force has been operating on a more of an accelerated schedule. So they have already divided up into subcommittees, as you know, and they are now moving full steam ahead with the assumption that there is going to be an interim report, likely in April. There's going to be a full report targeted for August. That is decidedly different from what we have been operating on in terms of our schedule. So before that, we as a committee felt 100% comfortable with what the task force is asking us to do, it was important for us to understand that our effort with them would require us to be aware of their timeline and ensure that we are able to dedicate enough time to come up with our strategic bullet points in the area of public safety. I am certainly for that notion. I believe that we can do so, but that is a discussion point I felt that we need to have as a committee.
Thank you, Isa. I think that's a great point of emphasis, and just following up on that as well. Isa was right. There were both the committees the task force and the committee were enacted at the same time. However, the task force had really, in its recommendation, a one-year timeline. Now, as part of their recommendations, they could make a recommendation that the task force would continue, but that would have to be overtly made as part of their recommendation in order to continue past that first year. from the advisory committee standpoint, our intention was to keep this as a perpetual standing committee in partnership with the police department. There is no finite timeline. And frankly, there may be topics that we come to resolution on and you make recommendations and we adopt and move forward that we may revisit then later in the future. And that's the important piece, is that we have continual dialogue. And as I've mentioned before, there's always an opportunity for us to take a look at the progress we've made, where we stand currently, and where we would like to be in the future as expectations change, as our industry changes, as there are progress and developments in policing. We would want to make sure we adopt those best practices as well. So that's, I just want to make sure I, again, follow up and distinguish that those two timelines we can reconcile. It's not a push for us to move any faster, but it is an ask that we are able to meet the timeline from the task force on this specific request. One other piece I want to answer, because I know Judge Maynard has asked in the past about the report required to go back to council from this group. And so right now, if I remember correctly from last week's meeting, the task force is shooting for an April update report to council. As best we can reconcile the calendar, my intention would be to provide our update report to council at that same meeting, because naturally if council receives a report from one group, they may ask, where are we at with the task force? Where are we at with the advisory committee? So my hope would be to work with Judge Maynard and with Ms. Hawk to put together a report from this committee to accompany the task force update report in April. That does not mean we have to have finalized recommendations. It is just a update on what progress we have made or what conversations we have had to date, so that council is aware.
Okay, well, there's plenty for us to chew on. Ajmiri, was there, well, I think that another point that just needs to be interjected is the fact that Esau was good enough to suggest that there be some type of meeting and dialogue amongst the committee chairpersons of both the task force and our Chiefs Advisory Committee. And that hasn't taken place yet. But I think that certainly before they have their scheduled meeting in March, we will have had that meeting. That I also believe it would be advantageous to have Esau attend, as well as the chief and the city manager. And so I want you all to be aware of that as well. And Ajmiri and I have had some discussion about the issue. And Ajmiri, I'd like to give you the opportunity to offer any comments or thoughts that you have in terms of how you understand things to be proposed, and how you feel that we as the Chiefs Advisory Committee might be able to be of assistance to the community task force.
Thank you, Judge. I did have a discussion with the chief about this specifically, maybe a week or so ago. I actually don't remember. Was it a week ago or was it 3 days ago? I can't tell. But he clarified a lot of things for me, because initially what it looked like in the example was that we would be a subcommittee under the task force, but essentially that's not what's happening. We are still a separate committee, completely of our own agenda that we have to complete, but we will be taking the safety issues, just like Esau said. I know that it seems to be there's a lot of moving parts still, and there still needs to be a little bit more discussion and clarification, probably with Dana, and then also the other chairs from the community task force. So I don't want to speak out of turn and misinform anyone. I do think we need to have a little bit more discussion on this before we can come back to the full committee and then fully discuss it in a better manner. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. Chief and Esau, one of the things that I am concerned about, I guess, with respect to this timeline, is the fact that we tend to meet after the community task force meets, and consequently, more than likely, their next meeting will take place prior to the time that we as a Chiefs Advisory Committee meets again. So I think that, one of the things that we're going to need some clarification on, and terminology is probably part of it, is what these strategic bullet points might mean. And it's my understanding that whatever is being proposed for April is more in terms of a written update, as opposed to one where we actually go in and speak to council. Is that correct?
Judge, that's correct. That's my takeaway from my conversations with the city manager, is that there would be a report from the community task force, but that wouldn't necessarily require an appearance from members of the advisory committee at that time. It may require the chairs from the task force to attend that council meeting, but it wouldn't necessarily require our attendance. Now, for our report separately, we can talk about whether or not we are at a point where we would need you and Ajmeri to come to a council meeting, or we could submit that simply as an update for council to review. Depending on the recommendations we received from the advisory committee at that time, we would just want to make sure, again, that we reconcile the reports so they're coming at the same time, just to give an update to council on where we are at currently.
Okay. Well, thank you. And obviously, we're going to continue to have conversations offline between the chair and vice chair, yourself, and Esau. I just want to give everybody else, though, an opportunity to offer some input if they would like at this time, and if not, we'll move on. Chief, you can see everybody, so if there's someone who wants to offer input, please raise your hand, let the chief know, or just chime in.
Yes, sir. Imran, I think, has something to say.
Thank you, Chief, and thank you, Judge, for providing this update, as well as Esau for bringing visibility of what the other task force is doing. My just a general thought process when I was hearing this discussion going on: does it make sense, a strategic sense, for us to also have some subcommittees that might be working in different directions? And Chief, you might be able to better define that. If you have specific goals that you expect us to be delivering, let's say in 2021, 2022 timeframes. So if you have some input in that regard, I think that will be pretty helpful, because coming to the monthly meetings and finding out that we are only working on maybe one goal or two goals. We all can be working in a lot of different directions, because public safety is definitely a big spectrum, and we can probably subcategorize it into multiple efforts, and each one of us maybe can take a role play and report it to Ajmeri and the judge on a routine basis, and that can be a status report that comes to you on a monthly basis as well. So something to kind of think outside the box, but I feel like there is an opportunity here to have subcommittees within this larger advisory commission as well. So.
Thank you, Imran. I think that's a natural question. I will tell you, and again, I'll ask Esau to weigh in if he has a different perspective. As they have divided into subcommittees on the task force, one of the lessons that we have learned and in the arena where we are holding public meetings, but we're holding them virtually, navigating the tenuous nature of making sure it's accessible to the public, but also we are able to get together without having to be in the same room. All of those subcommittee meetings have had to be treated as if they are public meetings in and of themselves. So then it does, and it is something we could navigate if that's the way we chose to do it. I will tell you, there have been a little bit of complications and wrinkles in being able to pull people together for an additional meeting. But it is an option we could think through. I think, as the judge mentioned and as Mary has mentioned, as we pull the chairs from both the task force and the committee together, that's a discussion I think that we could have during that conversation. And the other piece I would offer as a recommendation or suggestion is, I know we have navigated through how to have communication as an advisory committee outside of the meeting times through a point of contact here at the Justice Center through Ms. Metcalf, to be able to provide some feedback and dialogue to build the agendas. And it may be plausible that we might be able to gather an idea of what people are suggesting as areas of focus for this task through that way of communication as well. But all of those are options. That's a great question, Imran. I think that one of the things we'll do as we get together in that meeting in the near future with the task force and the advisory committee chairs is talk through what's the most advantageous way for us to hit the timeline and also include as much perspective as we possibly can.
You saw anything? You're in one of those committees, subcommittees, I should say.
I am, and I think it could be a very beneficial structure if we can clearly define different areas to address for each subcommittee. As Chief said, it does not perhaps function as we typically think of what subcommittees are. At least in my mind, when I hear subcommittee, I think of a more nimble body, a smaller gathering that can more easily meet, more easily communicate, and make decisions that would flow up to the whole body. In this instance, that is not going to be the case, because as Chief said, every single one will have to be treated as a public meeting unless no decisions are being made in that particular meeting. So I'm a little divided on that right now. I'm on the fence as to whether that is going to be the most prudent use of everybody's time, or whether we should just stick together in this format.
Okay, great. Appreciate that.
Yeah, can I make a comment?
Go ahead. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. So, yeah, I agree with Esau. I mean, the reason is everything has to be public. So just if you cannot make a decision, then obviously we cannot do much progress. And good thing is, I'm looking at the Beaverton, the guidelines, the plan. I think at least we have a template to get started. Of course, I mean, the points, I mean, we have to discuss as a team, maybe within one meeting, just kind of, we can start with the emails. There looks like there are 5 sections, and just we can, via email, just we can agree or disagree to the most point and just come to a, not a conclusion, but at least put together 3 or 4 points on each one under that, and then we can have in the next meeting, maybe, because if it's not too late, or maybe we can, like you said, Judge, I mean, we need to submit by April or something. I think maybe next meeting we can, in this kind of meeting, we can conclude what we want, what we would like to, like Cameron send a great article, not an article, report on feedback, right? I mean, that is that can be one of the items we can include as part of it. So we can decide what goes in, what does not goes in, but at least Chief has provided a template. I think it's a great start, and that saves a lot of time rather than we trying to figure out different areas. And I'll stop here. So that's my advice.
Yeah, I agree with that point. And I think that, like you said, there are 5 areas that are identified in the Beaverton plan, and we are already heavy into one of those, which is community engagement. So, my initial thought is that we may not get to all 5 topics, certainly by April. We may identify 2 or 3 that we would like to focus on, and then those would be the strategic bullet points that we would work from until it's time for that final document that has to be presented in August of 2021. It's just my thoughts, but thank you everybody for your input. Anybody else?
Judge, just the last piece, and just reflecting on Shri and your comments as well, just to give some perspective for those who haven't had a chance to review the Beaverton template. The framework for the community task force plan is intended to be broad. Those goals are not maybe as specific or as in the weeds as some of the discussions we're having about policy. So if it feels like it's taking on a lot, it is, because it's something new for us and something in addition to what we're already talking about, but they are intended to be sort of broad and projected goals, as opposed to the nuanced conversations that we're having about the SRO program, body cameras, response to resistance. And I know we're going to have to wear a couple different hats as we move through, but I will do, and we will do on our end here at the police department, everything we can to make it and facilitate it as easily as we possibly can, and also stay focused on the conversations that are pertinent to this advisory committee as well.
All right, thank you. Anything else for an update, Chief?
That's all I have, Judge.
Okay, very good. All right, we're going to move then into new business. And the first topic under new business, and Lieutenant Latansky, we are going to get to you. I promise we're going to get to you. But I wanted to follow up on the discussions that we've had about the SRO and CLO programs and try and wrap up that portion of our initial discussion on those issues with a dialogue and conversation that might lead to recommendations that at least we can put out there. And because Officer Collier is here with us, he can hear them. We recognize that anything that happens that is going to be long-standing will have to not only include the superintendent, but the school board as well. But, even against that backdrop, because of the amount of time that we have spent on this issue, I did want to have us tie it up with some final discussion and recommendations. And to that end, I've asked Cameron Justice if he would lead this portion of the discussion for the Chiefs Advisory Committee. So if that's all right with everybody, Camera, I'm giving you the floor.
All right, can everybody hear me okay? Awesome. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for being here. Chuck, thanks for taking the time out of your day to be here. Forgive me, I am coming from 8th grade baseball tryouts, so I'm a little sweaty and I'm not looking quite as sharp as Lieutenant Tabernick, but we'll keep moving with the information. So I just wanted to, as Judge Maynard mentioned, give a little brief facilitation that will hopefully lead to some recommendations that's sort of informed by a little bit of the research that I did and sent out to the group that is related to evaluations of the SRO programs. So, and then hopefully give others time to chew on some of that and give their own recommendations or just general thoughts. And I also think, as I mentioned, it's a really cool opportunity with Chuck being here to just kind of have a dialogue with those things. So the article that I sent out to the group was the first phase of that from the Center for Schools and Communities. And my hope with all of this, if we were to implement something similar, is that the data backs up everything that Chuck is saying and that all of the officers have said in reference to the SRO program, right? It's rooted in mentorship. Law enforcement is at the back end, only if it's needed, and then safety of the students, all of those things. And that's my hope. So a little bit of background just for context about the research that I did. There were 24 schools and or departments that were researched, and much like Dublin, there was an overwhelming support of the SRO program from school administration, which I think is important. And so much so that 12 of the 13 schools that lost state funding, for the SRO program funded it through other means. So they were so committed to that they chose to These research questions that I think are pertinent to our discussion that they looked at. The first is, what are the core components of successful SRO programs? The second being, what SRO functions do parents, teachers, and students perceive most positively? 3, does the SRO meet the expectations of the community? And maybe more for our discussion, do they meet the expectations of students? And so that's part of one of my recommendations that I'll save sort of for the end, is having students involved in that process. They also did SRO interviews, which you can find, I think, on like figure 93, like page 57, some place really far into it. And 21 out of the 21 officers that were interviewed said the same thing that you all have mentioned. Mentorship and teaching and counseling is at the forefront. None of them said that law enforcement was the first thing, which I think is also important and very similar. In terms of the thing that I found important and that hopefully some of you picked out of the bunch, is that they came up with 5 best practices. That's on page 9. And most of them are things that Chuck alluded to. So I think that's good that there's quite a bit of overlap there. The first being, select officers that have experience and want to work with students. That might seem like common sense, but part of what they mentioned is having officers that volunteer to do that as opposed to being assigned to that space. The second is, identify SROs with a genuine belief and commitment to the value of school police partnerships. The third being, select officers with significant experience and knowledge about community policing and juvenile law. The fourth, select individuals who are native to the area, attend the school system, or are related to someone in the area, or are familiar with the community. That sort of goes back to the community policing portion. And provide essential SRO training, which we've alluded to some extent in the past. Picked out from the article, or the research, I should say, is the largest room for improvement among the groups that were observed is transparency, to sort of help improve the general attitudes towards the SRO programs. Figure 8 specifically, which is on page 14, it says that SROs consistently came up 6th or 7th out of 8 in terms of who students would want to go to if they needed help with something. And granted, that's not inherently bad, but if the focus is mentorship, we'd love to see that up at 4 or 5 after, teachers, parents, friends. Just something that I noticed. Again, it's not inherently bad that others come before that, but potentially bumping that up could be good. And then figure 34 on page 27 says, this was asked of parents, but I certainly think it could be applicable to students. When asked, what are the most important roles of monitoring schools consistently for mentoring, which I think is important just in terms of the disconnect between what you all are doing and what the perception is. So again, just tying it all back, the importance of that transparency is a way to influence those attitudes, potentially bump those things to the forefront that you all do a great job of to begin with, but also can help community members, students, parents understand those things a little bit better. And so just in terms of the recommendations that I have related to those things, I think it's important to take evaluations from students and parents that are informed by some of the research that I sent out. Specifically because if students are the population that you all are serving, it is equally important to have their opinions at the forefront. And hopefully, like I said earlier, it will be confirmation of everything that Chuck has said and everything that officers school source officers are, and it's just bolstering the good work that the department is doing. And then I think a second thing that we've mentioned and sort of alluded to, and then I'll take your thoughts, are the importance of training. And specifically, if we have an opportunity to get some outside agencies to be a part of that training or shape some of the curriculum. So those are all of the things I have, and I would love to open it up to everyone else to share some of their thoughts.
Cam, I am just excited to tell you that I can't wait for you to go to law school and really lead us into the future, because you are just amazing. So I'm really happy that you're a part of this. That's all.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
I just wanted to say the same thing. Just thank you for your work on that. That was a very concise rundown, and just makes me feel good about the work that the partnership we have, and that it seems to fall pretty in line with what you found, and that there's no glaring like, oh my gosh, you know, here's what people are expecting, or here's what things are happening across the country, and we're not doing any of that, and our SROs are doing this and this and this. Seems like we're pretty in line with that. So as far as making updates or changes or amendments, if anything, something little, and that makes me feel good as being an educator in our schools. So thank you.
Right. Yeah, Courtney, you bring up a great point. I think it goes back to hopefully confirming everything that you've said, but we can't know that unless we take evaluations from students. And again, with their opinions being the most important in terms of the population that is served, I think it's sort of a no-brainer to include them in that process. Again, if nothing else, to confirm them, certainly ways to be better. So thank you for that.
Just give me 2 seconds to again pump up Dublin Police and Dublin SRO program. And I don't have numbers in front of me, but I do think we're one of the few departments and SRO programs that actually step into an elementary school. So across the country, I think that's rare. So all of our middle school SROs go out, and at least once a week, they're checking in on their assigned elementary schools. I know Officer Evans, Kathy Evans, she goes out, she solicits times where she can go read in the classroom or things like that. And again, it's all about normalizing what that police officer is. You know, we don't want that police officer to be some big scary entity that you only see the bad things on TV or hear about on the news. We want that person to be real. We want that person to be a parental unit when he or she needs to be for that child. And I just think Dublin does a really good job with that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that's my hope. I'm going to sound like a broken record, is that it just illuminates everything that you're saying as a way to just bolster that good work. So yeah, I agree. Thank you.
There are a couple of things I wanted to say. One, from our last meeting, Ajmiri, I think that you interjected that it was important for the SROs to recognize that they could represent a safe space for students. And, you know, that's kind of some terminology that I would like the department maybe to adopt, and Officer Collier, you hear and just jot down and maybe use in conversations that you might have, you know, with whomever you report to, be it the school board or the superintendent. There is a desire to have. Well, there is a belief amongst the committee that the SROs can serve if they don't already. But it sounds like from what you said, they do, as a safe space for the students. I think that that's an important.
Yeah,
without
doubt. And I know there are currently some SROs who have had those opportunities. I know in my time as the SRO, I had several youngsters come to me and say, hey, I just need to go somewhere. I'm ready to pop off or do this or do that. I just need to get away from it. So we walked back to my office. We hung out for a little bit, just chit chat, get that individual calmed down to where he's or she is able to re-enter the classroom or re-enter, you know, just the daily school life without having to worry about one little trigger setting him or her off to where they might end up in some trouble with the school or, you know, even worse.
Yeah. And I think that this is important from an educational standpoint, you know, and maybe a training standpoint, that having SROs function in that way is advantageous and all of that. Susan, you had mentioned something in the last meeting that I thought was important on this issue, and it had to do with finding pre-existing times or something like that. You said pre-existing times where interaction and input from students, teachers, maybe parents, and administrators could take place on the role and issues surrounding SROs. Do you remember what you were saying in that
Sure.
regard from the last meeting?
Yeah, thank you, Judge. So really, when I think about the importance of getting feedback from people, one of the most difficult things is time. Everybody's busy, everybody's got 1,000 things going at once. And so tapping into those pre-existing things, you know, whether it's when a parent is registering a new student with the district, or orientation, or teacher conferences, those would be for parents and caregivers. Really kind of looking at what things already exist, where you can capture those audiences so that it doesn't feel like another thing. It's like, oh, I'm already here and they're asking me this question, whether it's a short survey or a short discussion back in the land when we could be in person. You know, I had times where I was just camped out in one of the cafeterias and had, you know, hey, here's who I am, and people just came and talked to me. And so it could be something like that where it's informal and it doesn't feel quite as intimidating. Some of these things would have to be discussions with the district. I know they naturally have to be protective of like how many surveys and things go out to students and parents. But I think that that's a really good tool as well, because most students are, I mean, especially right now, on their devices quite a bit. But the other piece I would say is really thinking about frequency, because yep, those natural things that are already built in, let's capture those times, but we also don't want it to be a one and done. And so thinking about how do we keep the importance of the conversation going. You know, initially maybe it's more frequent and then we bump it back. And also, and I don't have all the answers for these things, I'm just putting them out there because they're in my head, but also trying to be really mindful about getting good, solid representation across the board with populations, you know, and that's for parents and students alike, because there are some students, for whatever reason, whether it's a trauma or experience with law enforcement, they're not going to be in a focus group. They're not going to fill out a survey, but really trying to figure out how do we get good representation. So like Cam was saying, we really want to capture the good stuff that's happening and look at where can we tweak things so that we can be even a little bit better. So that's kind of where my head was going.
I will say, just to throw this out there, Dublin schools, they do a survey every couple years. Cam, back when you were in school, it was probably called the Pause Survey. Now I think it's Oh Yes. And while they don't ask any specific school resource officer questions, they do ask how the kid feels in school. Do you feel safe? Do you feel scared? Things like that. And overwhelmingly, our kids feel safe in their schools, which is great all across the board. But it just doesn't have that specific SRO piece for the question.
I do want to just just a cautionary note that surveys tend to favor the majority. So maybe that we could use panels or some other way of getting student reactions to SROs. I do think historically surveys are always going to come back favorable for the majority, because they are the majority. And right now we're talking about the minority, which is what we're focusing on. So I do think that whenever we do talk to schools or whoever is going to be in charge of this, we're going to have to figure out a better way to get honest reaction from the kids.
I completely agree. And you didn't hear me because I was muted. I said yes. So if you or anyone else has, I think, ideas for the district as well, and any research to support other means to get adequate information, I think that's probably going to be helpful for us to be able to offer, because they do a lot through surveys because that's the easiest. But I think if we want to suggest another way, we might want to come up with a couple ideas.
There are companies in Columbus that do focus on how to get honest reactions without surveys. And I've been involved with a couple just myself, so I can always forward that information onto the chief after this.
Just forward it to all of us, Kashmiri.
Sure, I will.
And just to clarify, we will want to gather the voices of when we say our students defining K to 12. Am I correct? Okay. Since we do have school resource officers at the elementary level. So I just wanted to clarify the age gap so that if in the past only our high school or middle school students received that survey, that we may want to include the elementary level as well.
Cam, is that something that you could comment on in terms of the
So,
recommendation that you're making?
yeah, the research itself that this was rooted in, and granted, we don't have to go straight based off of that, was just middle and high school. Now, tailoring an evaluation tool towards elementary school students, I don't think is impossible. I don't think it's something that can't be done. That's just something that we have to be intentional about. So I think that's doable. And I think depending on Officer Collier, you can probably speak to this a little more. What if SROs are in K through 3, or if it's just 3 through 5, or is it?
They tend to try to go over during lunch times just so more kids can see them.
Yeah.
As far as the classroom engagement on the K through 5 side, it's typically the older ages, 3, 4, and 5, just because they have more awareness about who this person is in front of them.
Yeah, that makes sense. And that would be far easier to tailor some sort of evaluation tool towards. So that's perfect.
Imran,
Sorry.
Who is it?
Oh, this is Sri.
Okay, Sri.
A quick question. Do we do any in-person feedback, like interviewing people or anything in addition to the surveys, online surveys? It's a check, more of a check or any SROs kind of thing.
As far as I know, the only thing that Sergeant Rice, the CEU supervisor, solicits is feedback from administrators, people in the office, things like that. It's not strictly administrators, but she does send out a blanket email, and she sends, she doesn't send, but she has Corporal Morris go out and actually talk to individuals as well, trying to get feedback for the SRO evaluation.
Thank you.
Imran, in your comments on this issue, you talked about a desire to have the committee members have the opportunity to also participate or engage in any sort of DEI training that the SROs would go through. And
Yes,
I wanted to know if you wanted to expand on that in discussion with Officer Collier while we have him here.
Thank you, Judge, and thank you for bringing that point. I think Cameron covered most of the details in his presentation very eloquently, and thank you, Cameron, for that. I feel like, yeah, there might be an opportunity for us to maybe not audit, but like maybe, tune into the training in the near future to see if there are any deltas from our perspective that we can, go ahead and provide some recommendations. And again, there may or may not be, but at least, that will be a due diligence that we can do as the advisory commission. Because often a time, like if that training material was, created like maybe 5, 10, 15 years ago, it might be time for it to it can benefit a little bit from the facelifting of the changes that are happening in the, socio-economic or socio-political fabric of the community and the growth that is happening all around us. So from that perspective, I was hoping that if we can at least, tune in to the next training session that might be in the pipelines, we might be able to at least observe and, provide some assessment to the chief as well and the department.
Yeah, I thought that was a great point. Just to offer this in conjunction with what has already been said, timeline, Susan talks about pre-existing times or whatever, and I'm thinking that it would be good, however this input is gathered from students, potentially parents, teachers and administrators, whomever is involved in this process, that of course it would be great to have it at the beginning of the school year, and certainly at some point before the end of the school year. But you know, we're talking about August, September, and then April or May, and then utilizing the time period in June and July to do some educational training based in part on what is learned from this information and data that was gathered at the beginning and the end of the school year. And then, you know, we're still in existence as a committee in June and July. And if committee members had a desire of participating in the training, that would be, it seems to me, a natural time period for that to occur. And then that would help to shape however SROs would function going into the next academic year, which would, you know, begin again in August of 2021 still. So that's how I look at it from a timeline standpoint, and certainly appreciate everybody's input in the discussion. Anybody else, or Chief or Officer Collier, anything else that you would like to say at this point? And then Cam, is it possible that whatever the recommendations are, we can maybe capture them so that we're talking about something strategic, a strategic bullet point, a blueprint for the SRO scenario?
Yep, I already have a handful of things written down. We can discuss further at some point, some more concise stuff.
Great. Thank
So,
you.
Yeah, I'm gonna go ahead and head out. I appreciate you guys letting me hijack your meeting for a little bit. Hopefully I don't keep you there until 9 o'clock now, but Chief, anybody from the PD knows my email address. If anybody wants it, Stella or Courtney could give it to you. Feel free to email me any questions, concerns you have. My email's never turned off, so I will get back to you at some point. So I have an open door. You can come talk to me about any of these issues, any of these questions, comments, concerns that you have anytime. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Chuck.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's good to see you.
Thank you very much, Chuck. Have a good evening.
Good night, guys.
Any final words on this issue, Chief?
No, once again, I just, I want to thank Cam for coming up with and coordinating some information to go out in advance of the meeting and giving some framework for the discussion as we move towards recommendations. And I just appreciate your willingness to, again, we talked about this a little bit or alluded to it as we talked about the amount of time we've spent on this topic. We will sit down in a topic for as long as we need to help make sure everybody is confident that they've got the information that they want, that they need to be able to make recommendations to us. And so I just appreciate you guys continuing to have the dialogue and working towards recommendations for us, certainly.
Okay, great. Hey, guess what? We're actually going to get to Lieutenant Latanzi at this time. And Chief, if you set it up how you would like to, we'll let you guys take it from here. And Ajmiri, I'm going to ask that in terms of discussion, that you kind of lead that portion after the presentation from the department, if that's okay.
Everyone, I'm going to be sharing the screen for Lieutenant Latanzi, so just give me one moment, please.
And Judge, just as intro so that we can give Lieutenant Latanzi as much time as we possibly can to go through, I just will, as frame of reference, we have a lot of information and slides we have put together that Lieutenant Latanzi has painstakingly gone through to collect and gather for our discussion. there's a lot of information. We do not have to rush through all of the information tonight. Just as we started with the conversations about the school resource officer program, we want to take as much time to carefully go through to explain as thoroughly as we can and then answer any questions as they come up. So I just wanted to make sure I laid that foundation too, so you know if there's anything that we need to pause on. Again, to sit down in that conversation until we have looked at it from all 360 degrees, please feel free to do so as Lieutenant Latanzi goes through the information this evening and in the future. Thank you.
Thanks, Chief, and thanks, Judge, and the rest of the committee for the opportunity to present on our response to resistance and subject control policy procedure and give you an overview of how we train as a police department in this specific topic. So in regards to response to resistance and subject control, what many of you may have heard this called previously or in the news is use of force as it relates to police and citizen encounters. Our goal in every citizen and police encounter is to gain voluntary compliance from that individual that we're dealing with. Many situations that we deal with on a day-to-day basis never end up progressing to a point where we need to take somebody into custody or find ourselves in a situation where this even becomes a relative option for an officer during that interaction. However, some of those situations where we do need to either take somebody into custody for their own well-being or because they've committed a violation that would necessitate arrest. Sometimes we run into situations where obviously those encounters don't nearly go as smoothly as we would like them to do. And this policy helps our agency guide interactions in those situations where we can't gain voluntary compliance from an individual. Now, what that looks like on a year-to-year basis is different for our agency. However, I did want to start by giving you a little bit of information about 2020 to have in the back of your mind as we go through this presentation. So if you could imagine the entire year of 2020, we had 0.1% or 0.1% of incidents that resulted in a response to resistance or subject control technique used by one of our officers in relation to our total citizen initiated calls for service. So what that equates to is 15 response to resistance or subject control incidents out of 16,150 citizen initiated calls for service. And what that looks like in regards to those numbers compared to our arrests, it's 2.8% of our arrests that resulted in some sort of response to resistance and subject control technique being used, which is 15 out of 533. So again, I want you to keep those in the back of your mind as we talk about what exactly a response to resistance and subject control technique is, how we report it, how we investigate it, how we hold officers and the agency accountable for those actions, in the review process that takes place to identify whether those are consistent with policy, case law, training, and whether we feel like as an agency that technique was reasonable based on the interaction that our officers would be having with that particular individual. So we have 8 dedicated trainers that that help our agency go through response to resistance policy. Corporal Jake Stoll may be joining us later this evening, had some family issues to deal with, but he will talk more about the training aspect of this once we get through the policy. But what I hope to gain tonight for you, or maybe in the next meeting, because again, we've got a lot of information to present, is for everybody to have an understanding of what we consider a response to resistance and subject control technique, how that and how that may be used by a Dublin police officer, what guidance we give to officers about response to resistance and subject control, about how and when would be appropriate times to use that in any given situation, how we test our officers' decision-making in a training environment to ensure they understand policy and expectation, And then also how we hold our agency accountable and how we evaluate each and every one of those incidents where we use response to resistance and subject control techniques. Rebecca, if you can go to the next slide, please. So when de-escalation techniques are not effective or appropriate, one of our officers acting in the scope of his or her employment may use only the level of force that is objectively reasonable to effect an arrest, detention, or a mission-specific seizure. And again, that is really the forefront of the guidance we give to officers, both legally and in policy, as to when they can consider using the appropriate level of force depending on the situation. Rebecca, next slide, please. Again, some of these slides are very lengthy, but I think it is important for all of us to have an understanding of some of the key definitions that you're going to see throughout our policy and how we explain the response, resistance, and subject control requirements that we have as an agency. So first and foremost, again, as I talked about, voluntary compliance from individuals. De-escalation is an important part of our policy and training as it relates to this topic. So we define that as taking action or communicating verbally or non-verbally during a potential physical encounter to attempt to stabilize the situation, reduce the immediacy of the threat so that more time, options, and resources can be called upon to resolve that situation without the necessity to use force, or to reduce that level of force that could potentially be an outcome from that situation. Some examples of that are command presence from officers, whether that be one or more officers, advisements, warnings, and verbal persuasion by our officers, and or repositioning themselves to buy more time, to gain more resources to resolve that situation without having to use force. There was a great example of that this past year. I'll kind of highlight very little of that incident, but we had an individual that was in mental health crisis. They actually came to the police department, but were in active crisis in our lobby, and our day shift officers went to try to investigate that further and get that person the help that she desperately needed in that case. She did not want any part of having discussions with the officers, didn't want officers to get close to her, didn't want EMS workers to get close to her. So our officers took hours trying to navigate that conversation with her. She was in and out of our building, in our parking lot, in our side yard, and they bought time. They tried to build rapport with her, started to communicate with her from a distance to try to stabilize that situation, and were able to get resources from other jurisdictions that have mental health experts that ride in vehicles with them to the scene, and were able to end up taking this individual into custody without a use of force, and get that person the medical attention that they needed and that they sought out by coming to the police department. But again, that was a great example of how our officers critically thought during that encounter as to what resources were available, and also using time that was on our side in that situation to resolve that without having to use any type of force. Force is any violence, compulsion, or physical constraint that may be exerted by an officer upon any other person. Minor hand-to-hand control techniques, such as handcuffing, would not be considered physical force. That definition is important when we talk about reporting, response to resistance, and subject control techniques. Simple handcuffing of an individual would not be considered a response to resistance and or a use of force, if that's the terminology you prefer to use. for reporting purposes at our agency. Anything beyond minor handcuffing, when it comes to physical interaction to get an individual into custody, would be considered a response to resistance and subject control, which ultimately would necessitate both reporting that incident and would spark an internal investigation, which I will cover later in this policy and presentation, as to what lengths that we go to investigate each and every one of those incidents. Again, response to resistance and subject control would be any physical force that is not intended to be deadly force. In response to resistance, subject control techniques include physical efforts to gain control, restrain, or overcome the resistance of another person. Next slide, please, Rebecca. These first two definitions on this page, again, keep those in mind as we start to talk later in this presentation about the different tools that officers have available to them beyond physically restraining someone. So if you think about OC spray, pepper spray, expandable batons, tasers, those type of tools, these two definitions at the top here will be beneficial for you to have a good understanding of as we talk about when we would potentially permit an officer to use one of those during an incident. So active resistance is physical confrontational behavior to directly obstruct the lawful efforts of an officer. So active resistance would be, as an example, maybe someone pulling away from an officer, or if an officer tells somebody that they're under arrest, maybe grabs their hand to put them in handcuffs, person pulls away and takes off running. That would be active resistance. Versus active aggression is behavior or actions with the intention of causing physical harm to another. So again, active resistance, if you put it on a level of continuum, active resistance would be lower, if you would, than active aggression in regards to the actions of an individual. Deadly force, again, fairly self-explanatory, but any force that would carry a substantial risk of death and or serious physical harm to a person. And I wanted to cover as well our definitions of duty to intervene and duty to report. So again, duty to intervene, if any of our officers observe someone else, another officer, using force beyond which is objectively reasonable under the circumstances, shall intervene to prevent that use of unreasonable force. So important piece of the policy that, again, we've already covered core values, what our agency believes in. So we make it upfront and foremost to our officers. If they see anything that they would deem unreasonable, it is their duty and obligation to intervene in that situation. And furthermore, they have a duty to report. So if they observe or have knowledge of another employee using force that exceeds that which we would permit in policy or by law, that they have an obligation to report that to a supervisor. Next slide, Rebecca. So in 2020, we had examples of response to resistance and subject control that ranged anywhere from a claimed injury after minor handcuffing. So that is another caveat to how we report and investigate these type of incidents. So we had one incident in 2020 where we were taking somebody into custody, handcuff them, and then during the transport, they said that their shoulder hurt from the position that they were in from the handcuffs. We would also consider those instances for reporting purposes, a response to resistance and subject control, so that way we can conduct an investigation as to whether the actions were appropriate in those circumstances. So we consider those as well as instances where we use some of these techniques. to do that. And again, that sparks an investigation, which starts with the on-duty supervisor responding to that incident and starting an initial investigation into that incident. But an officer is authorized to use approved techniques to protect themselves or others from immediate physical harm, to restrain or control an individual who's actively resisting, evading arrest or detention, and exhibiting active aggression. Again, back to those definitions we talked about earlier. Or to bring a situation safely under control when they can articulate circumstances which increase the risk to an officer and or public safety. Again, with our intention fully of gaining voluntary compliance from individual, and that we have an obligation to keep the public safe. In certain circumstances, officers are permitted to use trained techniques to get an individual under control. Rebecca, next slide, please. So we've talked a bit about physical force. Again, those are considered hand-to-hand techniques to overcome resistance from somebody else. So some examples of that would be joint manipulation, joint locks and holds, takedowns, placing somebody on the ground, using physical force to do that, pressure point holds, kicking, striking techniques. A majority of our response to resistance and subject control techniques are takedowns. So putting somebody on the ground to handcuff them. If somebody's resisting, we consider response to resistance and subject control, and the officers would report that to their supervisor, and that investigation would spark from them from there. We also carry a number of less lethal weapons. Those are weapons that officers are trained in and have at their disposal to potentially use in these instances where we cannot gain voluntary compliance. But again, we've got specific direction that they get on when and how to use those to hopefully resolve that incident as quickly as possible using minimal force in those situations. So those are basically any device that is designed to incapacitate, immobilize through the infliction of any less than lethal impairment of physical condition, function, senses, including pain and or discomfort. So those devices are OC spray or pepper spray, as you would commonly know that as, a conducted energy device, which is a taser. We have specialty impact munitions, known as SIMs, and what that is, go over it in a slide or two, is a less lethal shotgun that shoots a beanbag round if we have distance and time on our side to utilize in some serious incidents, and as well as an expandable baton. Next slide, Rebecca. So OC spray, we would permit an officer to use OC spray in conjunction with other techniques to stop somebody who's actively resisting, exhibiting active aggression, or to prevent somebody from harming themselves or someone else. When practical, we ask officers to give a warning to an individual before they would use OC spray in an incident. They would not be permitted to use OC spray on someone who is in physical control of a vehicle, obviously with the concern being that if they are sprayed with this, they're going to have difficulty seeing and operating that vehicle. And then again, most importantly to highlight is that we do not permit the use of OC spray on someone who is passive simply as a pain-inflicting device to ensure compliance. So we would only permit the use of OC spray for someone who, again, is actively resisting or is actively aggressive. And potential harm to themselves or other members of the community. Next slide. So the taser, again, verbiage the same at the top of that. An individual will have to be actively resisting, exhibiting active aggression, or to prevent somebody from harming others or causing serious injury to themselves would be the circumstances we would permit for an officer to use a taser. The only time an officer would be able to use a taser on somebody who is fleeing would be in those situations where an officer reasonably believes a crime has occurred that involved either the actual threatened or attempted infliction of physical harm. So for low-level incidents, if somebody ran from an officer, we would not permit for them to use a taser in that situation. It would have to be something that involved the threat or actual physical harm. Keep into consideration the next section of this slide that speaks to the times that officers should not use this device, because those are consistent with the next, the device that I'm going to talk about, which is that specialty impact munitions shotgun. Those are identical for the use of that as well. So should not use this on obviously pregnant females or individuals who appear to be frail or infirm, or somebody who's less than 80 pounds. Should not use this on somebody that is on an elevated surface, that's in physical control of a vehicle in motion, or again, anyone who is passive. We are not going to use any of these less lethal weapons on. Next slide, please. The specialty impact munitions, the SIMs, I think this is important to cover. So as you can see in the picture there, this very much appears to be a normal working shotgun. We have reconfigured those with the orange on both ends of those to indicate that those are less lethal devices. And as you can see there on the right of that picture, it's basically a sock with a beanbag type of projectile in that that we could potentially use for individuals who are exhibiting active aggression, or to prevent them from harming themselves, or from harming others, or from causing serious physical harm to themselves. So if you can imagine an incident where, you know, somebody potentially is threatening harm against themselves, and maybe they have a knife to their wrist, and we have distance and time to be able to try to negotiate and speak with them. You know, it would be a potential use of this to try to get that person into custody, but in most cases we would continue to try to negotiate and resolve any harm from that. But this again is something that is an option for officers if they have time on their side. To my knowledge, we've had these for don't quote me on this. We've had them for several years, and I don't think we've had an actual deployment of the beanbag round yet. We've deployed those and not had to use them on calls, but it's a good option potentially for those one-off situations where we're trying to prevent, you know, having a close physical interaction with somebody. You know, try to reduce the harm potentially from somebody causing to themselves. Next slide, please. So the expandable baton, again, this is, we go up kind of the tenure of the less lethal weapons. We would only permit an officer to use the expandable baton if they're trying to defend themselves or somebody else from a person that's exhibiting active aggression. So again, that's that behavior with intention to cause physical harm. Still asking officers to give a warning when reasonable before that, and then the areas of the body that an officer is trained to utilize this would be just center mass of the arms, legs, and or the torso. This would not be permitted to be used for any other areas of the body, head, neck, or any other potentially lethal areas of the body, unless deadly force would be authorized otherwise. Next slide, please. So pointing of a firearm is also a area of our policy that we looked at pretty hard in 2020 to make sure that we were giving officers appropriate guidance and expectation as to when it would be permissible to point a firearm at a person. So we have always operated under the caveat of Graham versus Connor and the reasonableness standard. So when you see the term objectively reasonable, we'll talk about that a little more in depth later on in the presentation. However, we felt it imperative to give some very clear guidance to our officers on what we felt as administration was reasonable, and the times where we would consider pointing a firearm at a person reasonable. So as you can see here, we feel like the most significant factor in objective reasonableness when it comes to pointing a firearm at another person is that the officer would have to have a reasonable perception of threat of death or serious physical harm to themselves or a member of the public. And that would be in consideration with the totality of the circumstances that the officer is facing at the time. And they should also consider factors such as the severity of the call or the offense that this person is potentially suspected of, the proximity of any weapon that may be close or nearby an individual, and then any prior knowledge of that individual's propensity for violence. So as it relates to deadly force, again, our intention is to try to de-escalate any situation that that we're faced with, whether it be something less than deadly force or deadly force. But if those attempts to de-escalate are either not effective or if they're not appropriate, given the potential resistance that an officer may face and the immediacy of that, one of our officers acting within the scope of their employment would be able to use deadly force in situations to defend themselves from a reasonably perceived threat of serious physical harm or death, to defend someone else from a reasonably perceived threat of serious physical harm or death, or to effect the capture, prevent the escape of a suspect if there is a substantial risk, and you saw that definition earlier in the presentation, that that individual will cause death or serious physical harm if that individual is not apprehended without delay. So there would have to be an immediate necessity to prevent that individual from escaping, because they would cause someone either death or serious physical harm, and that would have to be imminent. Next slide. So some other considerations on deadly force that are in our policy and protocols is that we normally, again, that firearms should not be discharged from or at a moving motor vehicle unless the person in the vehicle is immediately threatening the officer or another person with serious physical harm or death, and when the discharging of that firearm is the only reasonable perceived method to protect the officer's life or the life of another person from death or serious physical harm. We do not authorize deadly force against somebody who is only threatening themselves or property with death or serious physical harm. We also restrict the use of neck restraints, including the lateral vascular neck restraint. That is prohibited in our policy. And then in those situations where an officer's life is an imminent risk, or a member of the public's life is an imminent risk of death or serious physical harm, and the use of trained techniques in regards to response to resistance and subject control are not possible, or they're not working, we would permit our officers to use whatever means may be necessary to save their own life or the life of someone else. So a transition kind of from the overview of response to resistance and subject control, and move in towards how we investigate those incidents, kind of where the standard is for how we evaluate those, and the process of accountability for each and every one of those incidents. So again, our agency is going to conduct an administrative investigation into each and every response to resistance and subject control technique to determine whether that force was objectively reasonable, whether it was consistent with policy, with case law, and our training. So each time that this occurs, again, in 2020, that was 15 times, the supervisor that's on duty, we have a supervisor on duty 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, responds to that scene and starts their initial investigation. That initial investigation will include interviews of any witnesses that are at that location, a review of video, interviews with the person who the force was used against if they wish to speak with that individual, any camera footage, whether that's a business camera footage, body camera footage, cruiser camera footage, and they will package that all together and start the internal investigation process. And we ask them again to take a look at that, both for objective reasonableness and to determine whether that falls within our policy, our training, and procedures. So Graham versus Connor is a case in '89 that established the reasonableness standard for police officers, judging those incidents in regards to the totality of the circumstances, and focusing on topics such as the severity of the crime at issue, whether the suspect poses an immediate threat to the safety of the officers or other community members, and whether that individual is actively resisting arrest or attempting to evade arrest by flight. You can go to the next slide, please, Rebecca. So objective reasonableness. The reasonableness of an officer's use of response to resistance and subject control techniques will be determined by the totality of the circumstances known at the time by the officer, includes determining the necessity for appropriate level of force, including but not limited to the seriousness of the crime, the level of threat or resistance presented by that person, and the danger to the community. Next slide. So as I mentioned before, that investigator, the supervisor on duty, is going to be responsible for collecting all the witness statements from anybody that was on that scene, taking photographs when appropriate of any claimed or visible injury sustained as a part of that response to resistance, interviews from witnesses, the person involved, the officer, written statements, review of video, review of audio, and they will put that together in a comprehensive summary that will proceed through chain of command. Go to the next slide, please, Rebecca. So that initial report that the supervisor starts to gather that information is forwarded to one of our range and tactics instructors. Those individuals have additional training in reviews of these type of incidents and will give a recommendation as to whether they believe that action from one of the officers is objectively reasonable. And then that goes back to that original supervisor who collects all of those documentations in totality and submits a comprehensive review of that investigation to one of the bureau commanders, so Lieutenant Tabernick or I, and then we conduct a review of all of that documentation presented to us, a review of all that video and audio, as well as any other internal paperwork associated with that incident. And then we also write up a review of that incident and meet with the chief to present that fact pattern to the chief. The chief ultimately reviews all of that information as well, and then makes the final determination on whether that incident was reasonable, consistent with agency policy, and consistent with agency training. Next slide, Rebecca. Also, two pieces I think it is important to highlight: that if we feel like if we're doing an investigation into a response resistance and subject control and we think that there is a possible violation of the law, we would forward that information to the prosecutor's office for review of any potential legal violations. And furthermore, if any response resistance or subject control either results in or is likely to result in the death or it involves an officer-involved shooting, notifications will be made to the bureau commanders and the chief. And again, we would take that incident and ensure that an outside agency is requested to conduct that investigation. The preferred agency that we would use in those circumstances is BCI, or the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Identification Investigation, to conduct the criminal aspect of that investigation to present to a grand jury for findings of whether there was any violation of the law or not. We would also, after that investigation, would conduct an administrative investigation into that incident, but the criminal investigation would supersede that investigation. Furthermore, every year we do a thorough analysis of all of our response to resistance and subject control reports. We use that data from the analysis to identify any potential trends in either the race, age, or gender of the individuals that were involved in that, what officers are involved in those incidents, any patterns related to potential injury of either officers and or other individuals, as well as the impact potentially that any of those incidents would have on policy, practices, equipment, and or training, to see if we need to shift how we're training, shift direction and policy and guidance for the officers, or update and evaluate any of our equipment. So in 2020, this is a breakdown of all of our incidents of response resistance and subject control for 2020. So again, there was 15 of those incidents in 2020. As you can see on the left-hand side of the screen, 10 of those individuals that those techniques were used on were male, 5 were female. In the center column, you can see the actions of our officers. Again, that leads up to many more than 15 because in many of those cases, there are several of those used throughout that incident. But the most significant actions that our officers took on any given incident where they felt it appropriate and reasonable to use response to resistance and subject control was a takedown to conduct handcuffing in the prone position, which is many times a safer place to do that, which allows us to better control that situation and more quickly get that individual into handcuffs if they are potentially resisting. You can also see that there were 4 minor injuries sustained by subjects out of these incidents. One of those being out of the 15, one of those was simple handcuffing where somebody claimed pain in their shoulder due to the handcuffing. So that's included in here as well. And then there at the bottom in the center, you can see the race of the individuals who were involved in these incidents, 12 being white, 2 being black, and 1 being of Asian descent. So next slide, please, Rebecca. This is a breakdown of our use of firearms, taser, OC, and specialty impact munitions. So pointing of firearms, use of firearms incidents, there was a total of 34. We also include in the use of firearms reports anytime that we use our firearm to deal with a sick or injured animal. So anytime an officer would use their firearm in the course of their duty, in those cases, they would have to ask permission from their supervisor and also complete documentation as the circumstances of why they felt it necessary to do that. So that was 15 out of the 34. There were 19 incidents of pointing of a firearm throughout the course of 2020, and those stemmed from high-risk traffic stops where there were either weapons known to the officers or located in the vehicle that the officers were stopping, violent felony warrants, and then active violence or armed individuals out of domestic violence incidents. As you can see, there was 5 use of taser incidents, but to try to clarify how the taser works. So the taser actually has probes that are deployed out of it, and you can also use it by pressing it up against an individual and activating it. We had 0 of those incidents, but we also track when an officer would point their taser to gain compliance from an individual that may be either resisting out of a situation. So we had 5 incidents where officers used the taser either by pointing it at an individual and gaining compliance through those commands rather than an actual deployment of the taser. 0 uses of the expandable baton, 0 uses of specialty impact rounds in 2020. Did Corporal Stoll make it on the call yet? I'm not sure he was going to make it. He had some family things to tend to this evening.
Lieutenant, I believe so. Okay. This might be a good place for us, just considering where we're at.
Yep. Sorry, I just noticed the time. So I would be happy to entertain any immediate questions that anybody had about what we covered, and then maybe we can pick up training in our next meeting, or questions that the committee has gained over time after they've had some time to think about what we've talked about. But there is some additional components on training, scenario-based training that we conduct, as well as rendering aid after these incidents.
Thank you so much for this presentation. I actually have questions on almost every single line on those slides, but I know that the time is at 7:30 and we do end at 7:30, and I don't want to go over just for a few minutes, and I want to give this topic the weight that it deserves. And I want you to be able to finish your presentation before we even get into the questions, because I think that's the most appropriate thing to do. I do have a request. I don't see those slides in my email anywhere. Were those emailed to us? Oh,
No, those were not. Those have not been sent, but we will do that in between this
okay.
meeting and the next, so you can see the back end of the presentation. We were putting them together. Lieutenant was putting them together. We actually had in-service training last week, which helps inform some of the discussion that we'll have in our next meeting, as well as we talk about our analysis projecting into our training, which helps us further prepare to, again, bring situations to resolution as quickly and as safely as we possibly can. So we will definitely send that out in between meetings. Thank you for asking.
Yeah, I think everybody else is, are you guys okay with us ending today right now, instead of going into questions and just briefly touching on the subject and then really giving the weight that this this topic deserves at the next meeting and really focusing on that? Okay. I think I see it. Oh, Judge, yes, go ahead.
Have one thing that I wanted to share. Yes, we need to get to as many subjects as we can, but I wanted the lieutenant and the chief to know those areas that we would like to focus on, so that for as much time as we can, we'll get to the things that the committee has identified as are important to them or to us. And Chief and Lieutenant, that would include body-worn camera policies, responses to civil disturbance policies and procedures, and a topic that we've identified as police department culture. And maybe that's something that we can talk about offline as well, so that you understand exactly what it is that we're concerned about. And or maybe Ajmiri or Cam, you can offer what you, how you see that particular issue.
Judge, if I can quickly ask another question, very brief one. Is it possible to also get maybe data for like last 2019 and 18 as well, kind of incorporated in the slide? Because it seems like 2020 was more of like a COVID period where like maybe the crime in general was not that at a peak, but maybe comparing last year's data to 2019 or 18, if you can have some of those numbers as well in the next presentation, that'd be helpful. So.
Yep, absolutely, Imran. I can get that for you.
Okay, that'd be good. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Yep, great question. Yep, we do the analysis each and every year, so we can provide as far back as you would like us to be able to inform the discussion.
Mary, you still there?
I am having some issues in my house with electricity, so I'm on my phone, so I apologize for that. But is there anything else you'd like to talk about, Judge?
Not on that issue. I
Okay.
did want to go ahead and give Chief and Rebecca the opportunity to touch on that last topic on our agenda for the evening.
Perfect, Judge.
All right.
Thank you, Judge. I appreciate having a few minutes here. And I want to thank Judge Maynard for allowing us some time during the meeting and for partnering on ideas for us to recognize Black History Month during our meeting tonight. I also want to thank Rebecca, obviously, for preparing our slides, honoring African-American pioneers in law enforcement and recognizing members of our police department tonight. So the slide we have in front of us, Black History Month being honored in February. So we have African-American pioneers in law enforcement we wanted to recognize. In 1867, African-American police officers were appointed to the police department in Selma, Alabama. These officers would be followed in 1868 by officers in Jackson, Florida, and in 1870 by officers in Houston and Galveston, Texas. In 1916, Georgianne Robinson becomes the first African-American woman police officer serving in the Los Angeles Police Department. In 1941, William B. Lindsay becomes the first known African-American state trooper hired by the Illinois State Police. In 1966, Sheriff Lucius Emerson is the first elected African-American sheriff since Reconstruction, serving in Macomb County, Alabama. And then in 2017, Congresswoman Val Demings assumes office in the U.S. House of Representatives for Florida's 10th Congressional District. She became the first African-American police chief in Orlando, Florida in 2007. So again, we wanted to take a moment to recognize African-American pioneers in law enforcement. And thank you again, Judge, for partnering with us on ideas for the meeting tonight and recognizing Black History Month. But we also wanted to take an opportunity to recognize members of our agency. So as it relates to our agency, the first African-American officer joined our police department in 1993. And I also wanted to take an opportunity tonight to recognize our current members of our organization. So leading up to the meeting, I also had an opportunity to meet with Officer Paul Burks, Detective Dave Aronovic, records technician Linda Ritchie, and communications technician David Mason leading up to the meeting this evening. And I want to thank Paul and Dave and Linda and David for giving me their permission and support to share their stories tonight as well. So I want to highlight each of those employees that I was able to speak to leading up to the meeting tonight as well. So Officer Paul Burks, who you guys are familiar with, obviously, has been a part of our discussions over the last several meetings. Began his career with the Dublin Police Department in 2000. He is a school resource officer with us since 2016. He's got 29-year law enforcement career as a veteran in law enforcement. He has worked with the New York City Police Department, patrolling in the Bronx and Queens area, Arlington Police Department in Texas from 95 to 2000. He has served as a patrol officer and a DARE officer. In 2016, he was recognized as the State of Ohio Crisis Intervention Officer of the Year. He is currently our Jerome High School School Resource Officer, and he is a trainer for our active threat, distracted driving, hidden in plain sight, and women's self-defense classes for our organization. Detective David Aronovic has been with our organization since 2018 and was recently moved into an assignment in our detective bureau beginning this year. He is a 15-year law enforcement veteran. He started his career at Howard County, Maryland Police Department in 2005 through 2018 and was assigned to the Special Assignment Section for 4 years. Assigned as a detective first class in the Narcotics Division in the Street Drug Section. He's a trained hostage crisis negotiator and involved in dozens of critical incidents and crisis and throughout his career in assisting through negotiations. Awarded the third highest award presented by his former department and has earned the Dublin Police Award of Merit for successfully negotiating with an individual experiencing a mental health crisis. And in particular on that incident, Lieutenant Latanzi, Lieutenant Tabernick, and I were all there present for that incident as Detective Aronovic negotiated for 4 hours straight with an individual who had threatened to harm himself and was able to successfully bring that situation to resolution without any additional incidents or harm involved in that incident. So he's a fantastic addition to our organization since he's joined us in 2018. Another recent individual who has joined our organization here this year, David Mason, is a communications technician with us in the Northwest Regional Emergency Communication Center. He just joined us this year. He's previously with the Delaware County Communication Center from 2016 to 2021, where he, during his time, also as a communications training officer in his time with the organization. He twice in his time with Delcom received the Lifesaver Awards, and in 2019 was the Dispatcher of the Year for the Delaware County Communication Center. We're very proud to have had him come to our organization and join us in NREC. And then Linda Ritchie is a records technician with our organization. She has been with the Dublin Police Department since 1995. She also serves as an alternate for our property evidence technician and as a special duty coordinator. She has assisted with major software implementation, and she has done a great deal of training for our members in the time that she's been with our records section and training new members for the organization, and also members who are temporarily sometimes assigned to or given assignment in the record section as well. And I got a chance to sit down with Linda, and she wanted me to share some thoughts with the advisory committee. So we wanted to make sure I read what she took the time to write out for us tonight. Linda shared, I have been with the police department for a considerable amount of time. One distinguishable moment is when I greet someone who looks like me. The surprised look on their faces and then the pride that follows evokes a sense of joy that is difficult to explain. And Linda wanted to emphasize that sometimes being able to see someone, as members of the committee have offered in the past, that looks like me, sometimes takes away that fear and helps alleviate the concerns about being open and vulnerable and asking for assistance. And so Linda wanted to emphasize that one of the pieces of, or one of the moments in her career are those times where she is able to provide that for a member of the public who has come to the police department seeking assistance. And she also included this quote from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. she wanted to share as part of our recognition tonight as well. I believed that the unarmed truth and unconditional love will have the final word in reality. This is why right, temporarily defeated, is stronger than evil triumphant. And I want to thank Linda for taking the time not only to write her experience, but to share that quote with us. And Judge, I just want to thank you again and the committee again for giving us the opportunity to recognize Black History Month and recognize pioneers in law enforcement and our employees here at the Dublin Police Department as well. So thank you again for giving us the opportunity.
Can't say thank you enough to both yourself and Rebecca. And I think I'm going to add Becky in because I know that I left some messages for her that she followed up on, obviously, with you and Rebecca. Rebecca, thank you.
Of course.
I almost am getting a little emotional.
Well, Judge, I want to thank you so much again for partnering with us, and I want to thank again Paul and Dave and Linda and David for giving their permission and support for us to share their stories as part of our recognition tonight. Because as we said from the beginning, our hope is as we continue to have dialogue and opportunity to come together and talk about police and talk about our police department. For me, what we do, why we do it. And the most important piece I want to get to eventually is for you to know who we are. And so tonight, to be able to share the stories of 4 of our members, I just want to thank you for giving us that opportunity again.
Okay. Well, I want to obviously say thank you to you guys, but I also want to say thank you to the other members of the Chiefs Advisory Committee for making me feel comfortable enough to try and build an additional bridge, not only between the department, but also amongst ourselves. And I want you all to know that I am open to conversations where we identify other events in the coming months that are culturally or ethnically based, and would like to utilize this forum as an opportunity to help educate us all as to not only our differences, but those things that make us all part of this community that we're trying to build. Inclusion, diversity, certainly, and equity. That's all I have. Rebecca, is there anything that we need to discuss in terms of public commentary?
We didn't receive any public commentary for this month's meeting, Judge, so I don't have anything to add.
All right, thank you. How do you want to speak on recommendations for our meeting, our scheduled meeting in March at this point, particularly in light of the fact that we need to be cognizant of what the task force is doing. Its date in March is, I think, the 18th, which I think is is that a Tuesday? They meet on Tuesdays.
The Judge.
18th is a Thursday, Judge.
No, I think they meet on Tuesdays, though.
Yes.
I think
Next meeting is on the 16th.
Yeah, they meet on Tuesdays. To me, the meeting between the chairs and vice chairs is the important meeting that needs to take place. And I still feel more comfortable not having us rush to schedule a meeting in the next 2 weeks to be accommodating of the task force. So as always, we can continue this discussion offline and pick our date. But I am letting you all know that I don't feel pressed to try and come back and have a meeting prior to the 16th of March.
Judge,
Anybody else?
Judge, I just wanted to add that maybe we should think about having a specific date that we meet every month, just like the task force or city council or school board. That way it makes it easier, one, for the community to actually engage with us, because if we continue to have a moving target, it's less likely to have community involvement. And two, we can just set our schedules out on, I don't know, the third Thursday of every month, or I'm just saying that as an example. But if we do that, that's easier for all of us as well to work around. So just a suggestion for the community members to think about. Thank you.
Maybe fourth Thursday, because today is 25th, next 25th is fourth Thursday. So
I think next month might be a spring break in the mixes, so we might want to be careful when we schedule that.
Yeah, it's spring break.
Yep.
Yeah. Is it that Thursday, or is it that following week, the 26th? I mean, the Monday, the 29th through whatever the 2nd of April is. Is that, or is it that the week before?
yeah, that's I think that's a week, 29th to 2nd.
Okay. So in
Because
theory,
I know I'm going to Florida.
So we could, I mean, we could tentatively say the 25th, unless you guys
Yeah.
want to, unless you want
I'm
to come
sorry,
back.
29th to 4th, 29th to 2nd, so 25th we can do that, I think.
I just said Thursday as an example, but if somebody wants to do Tuesdays, or like if we did 23rd or 24th, that's also a good day too. Just so everybody's aware.
Judge, for what
And
it's
that's-
worth, I will say, oh, sorry.
No, go ahead. Go ahead, Chief.
Yeah, for what it's worth, I will say that on our end, our Mondays and Tuesdays between council and then other meetings that are scheduled for the city, the beginning of the week sometimes tends to stack up quickly. Thursday seems to work well for us, and then having that little bit of space as the week begins to navigate whatever we need to with the agenda, I think has worked well when we've had it on Thursday. So my suggestion would be, much as Ms. Hawk has mentioned, Thursday might be a good day for us, and if we can just plug the next couple of meetings forward as the third Thursday of the month, we can take a look on our end to make sure it doesn't run into anything and send that out as a suggested date, if that is helpful at all in helping coordinate. Again, as Ms. Hawk has mentioned, being able to facilitate feedback from community members and to project when the next meeting will be or when those meetings will be in the future.
Okay, I know.
Sorry, I just wanted to say I would also just hesitate to book something on the 24th or 25th, just because I know some families like to extend their vacation a few days. So in order to just be cognizant of spring break, not just being that week, but families also kind of moving around that date to work around, I think it might be the best time to do it that third week, which is the 17th or 18th. So just a suggestion.
All right. Well, I think that either the 18th or the 25th can be our tentative dates. And we can say the 18th because I think, too, that we have to recognize that Stella has a class that she teaches on some Thursday of every month. And I think it's the last Thursday of each month. So if nobody really objects, we can mark the 18th of March.
Thank you for considering that. I am wrapping up my class this
You're
February.
here.
So yes, I am here.
Okay.
But that was very thoughtful. I appreciate that. My last class is this February. So just FYI as we move forward. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Will that suffice for now, Ashmiri? The 18th or the 25th, and we'll try to focus on the 18th and try and firm that up with Rebecca and Becky within a week or two at the most.
That's fine with
Within a
me.
week.
If everyone else is in agreement with that, that's fine with me.
Why don't you guys raise your hand if you're in agreement so that everybody that can see.
Sounds great.
Okay, good. Thank you. Is that sufficient on this topic? Rebecca, can you work with us on that?
Of course, I'll make sure that you all have the presentation materials before then that we reviewed today.
Yes. Okay, great. Anything else for the good of the order? Go like around the table and you can say yes, no, thank you, have a good evening, and all of that good stuff.
Have a good evening. Feeling tired. That's it.
All right.
But good. Thank you for it.
Anybody else? I would entertain a motion then to adjourn the meeting for February 2021.
I move to adjourn the meeting for February 2021. Thank you.
A second.
Thank you. We've had a proper motion and second. Any discussion? Any objection? All in favor then say aye.
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 And Chief, I'll give you the final word, but I'm signing off saying good night. Thank you all for really a good meeting. And thank you, Lieutenant, for putting that stuff out there for us to start to chew on. And we'll look forward to getting the additional information.
Judge, as always, thank you all for coming together with us tonight, and I look forward to our next meeting. Have a wonderful evening.
All right, great. Good night.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night, everyone.
All right.